Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to look at part 2 to creating your own custom VPC. So far we've created a VPC, we've got a public subnet, we've got a private subnet, we've got instances in both. But right now all we can do is SSH into our public instance, in our public subnet. We have no way of communicating to our private instance. So let's go ahead and figure out how we can do that. So I'm back in the AWS Management Console, and if I just go over to Services and go over to EC2, and we can see that I've got two running instances. I've got one in my public subnet, which is this one, my web server in US East 2A. Then I've got one in my private subnet, my database server, and it does not have a public IP address. What it does have, however, is a private IP address. Now, if I tried to SSH into it from my web server, it's not going to work. And the reason for that is they're in two separate security groups, and by default, the security groups do not allow access to each other. So what we might want to do is go ahead and create a new security group. Because this is my database server, we should probably have a database security group. Okay, so we're going to call this my DB security group, my database security group, and we're going to give it the same description as well, so my DB security group. The VPC, we're going to choose our A Cloud Guru VPC, and in here we add our rules. So what do we want to be able to communicate to EC2 instances inside this security group? Well, let's say the first thing we want is ICMP. We want to be able to ping EC2 instances inside this security group from our WebDMZ security group. How do we allow our WebDMZ security group to ping? Well, in here we've got to enter in our source. Now our source we can actually enter in SG and then type our WebDMZ security group in there, or we can actually use the IP address range, which is what I'm going to do. So it's 10.0.1.0 and then /24. And then I'm just going to delete that one there. And then actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type that out manually, and I'm going to copy this into my clipboard so I don't have to keep typing it again and again and again. So we're going to do this for ICMP. Then we're also going to do it for, let's do HTTP. We want to be able to talk to our our database servers using HTTP. Maybe we're installing management software to manage MySQL, for example. We also want to do it using HTTPS. So HTTPS in here. And again, we'll paste it in there. And then we also want SSH. So we'll type in SSH and our source address there. And then finally, we want to be able to communicate to our database servers using MySQL or Aurora, so port 3306. And you can see our ports are automatically populated in here, so you don't need to know your port numbers, but it's always good to know the common port numbers like HTTP, HTTPS, SSH, and MySQL. And so there we go, we've got it all set up. And then all we need to do is scroll down and go in and hit Create Security Group. And that is now creating our security group. That has now created a new security group, my database security group, which is in my default VPC. Next thing I want to do is just go over to EC2, and I want to move my DB server. I want to go ahead and change to networking, and we're going to go ahead and change security groups. And I'm going to basically add my DB and remove it from my default security group. And there we go. I'm going to go ahead and hit add. So that has now moved my security groups. Let's go down here and grab this private IP address. I'm just going to copy that into my clipboard. And then what we want to do is we want to SSH into our public web server. So I'm SSH'd in from the last lecture. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to type in ping, and I'm going to paste in the private IP address. And you can see that is now pinging. So I am now able to communicate from my public web server to my private web server. The next thing we might want to do is, if we just clear the screen, we want to SSH over to our private web server. Now to do that, what we're going to need to do is put our somehow access our key in order to do that. So I'm going to put the private key on this web server. Normally you would never do this in production. What you would do is use a Bastion host, and we're going to look at Bastion hosts later on in this section of the course. But just to keep things simple, we're all learning about VPCs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my private key, and I'm going to copy it into my clipboard. So I'm in my downloads directory. Here's my private key in here. I'm just going to go ahead and hit open. I'm going to open this with a text editor, and you can see it in here. And I'm just going to copy it into my clipboard. And then in here, I'm just going to do nano my private and then key.pem. So we're creating a file. I'm going to paste it in here. and then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control X, hit yes, and then enter. And then I'm going to chmod it to 400, so my private key pair. If we type in ls, you can see it in there. Grab your private IP address to your database server. And then all you want to do is type SSH EC2 and then -user and then @ and then the private IP address, then -i and then mypvkey.pem. Type yes in here. And there you go. You are now SSH'd into your database server, which is in a private subnet. So essentially, you're SSHing into your public server and then SSHing into your private server. Now, there's a much more secure way to do this using bastions, because the last thing you want to do is be saving private keys on your public web servers. I mean, what would happen if they got hacked? I'm just going to go ahead and elevate my privileges to root, clear the screen. Now, what do you think would happen if we ran a yum update? This is in a private subnet, don't forget. And this is going to take a little bit of time, but it's going to completely fail and time out. And that's because we're in a private subnet that has no route out to the internet. But at the same time, how are we going to do a yum updates? How are we going to go in and install software? We want to maybe go in and install MySQL. This is a database server after all. How do we do that? So that's what we're going to look at in the next lecture. We're going to look at NAT instances versus NAT gateways. NAT instances are fairly out of date, but they still do come up in the exam. I had a question on them just 2 weeks ago when I did my exam, and that has now failed. So that's what we're going to cover off in the next lecture, NAT instances versus NAT gateways. If you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.